Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, What Now? Building Our Ally Muscle for Inclusive Workplaces. And I am super excited that I get to have Jennifer Brown with me today, who's not only an expert in this, is not only someone who's helping bring attention to this topic, but I think between the two of us, hopefully we can give you quite a bit of practical, tactical, and tangible things that you can think about inside your organization. I think with all that's going on in the world, it was really important for me. We kind of threw the playbook out of the window with our schedule of webinars and said, this is something we really need to be talking about right now, and really put as much light on this as we can. And I've been hearing from so many organizations and from HR leaders and CEOs that they need more help. They need more tools. They need more conversation starters and things to work on inside their organization. So hopefully today we can be a part of that conversation. Now there are a little bit of technical things. Jennifer and I will be talking today, kind of splitting up. I'm going to introduce her in a moment. I'm going to kind of introduce myself, and then we'll get to Jennifer. I'm going to have her kick it off, and then I'll kind of wrap it up. And at the same time, we also have a third person helping us with the slides. So we're going to do our best to make all of the logistics here work. So if you can go to the next slide there, Veronica. Perfect. So my name is Chris Dyer. I'm really fascinated in how people work, how cultures work, and I've spent, my career with many different companies that I own in executing this. But we've also been able to be really successful by focusing on our people and our culture. And that's really my job almost 100% of the time. It's not to work in the business. I spend my time working on the business, and everything from culture to how we are a more diverse company, how we are more inclusive, how do we grow, how do we do all those things, how do we understand our clients better. And so that's really the angle that I'm coming from. Next slide. I've been really fortunate to have been featured on lots of different places, from on TV, on the BBC, on the AP, Inc., all kinds of different places. And I've written a book, which I'll mention here in a moment. Next slide. Kind of funny to say next slide. Usually I'm used to just kind of pumping through there. So I'm going to apologize in advance to Veronica. There's going to be a whole lot of button clicking. So go ahead and click it about 15 times. So my company, People G2, has been really fortunate. As I began to work on the business, we've been able to become a best place to work. Yeah, Veronica, just keep clicking. Just I'll keep talking through it. There we go. And been able to be on the Inc. 5000 list. It was 4 times. Don't tell anyone. We just got her. Will be our 5th time. It'll be our 4th time in a row to be a fastest growing company. And again, I attribute all of that to our focus on culture, our focus on who is working and how we're working, not so much on the actual, for me, not the actual business, which is really, really important. So you can keep clicking all the way through that until it disappears onto the next slide. There we go. And the final thing is if you want to get kind of an interesting update on where we're at, we were just featured in Inc. And talking about how we meet. My company is 100% remote. We have 40 people that are kind of our core, and we have 3,000 independent contractors that feel often like employees for us. So we have people all across the country that we work with, and we are hyper-focused on how we meet, curating that, how we interact with each other, and we've done over 100,000 virtual meetings since 2009. So lots of other resources if you are struggling with that and need help with that. All right, next slide. And so finally, the sort of lens that I'm going to be talking about later on is through my book, The Power of Company Culture. These are really the 7 things that we consistently see great cultures are focused on. And inside that uniqueness pillar is where we find diversity, it's where we find inclusion, it's where we find our ability to focus on what makes us different as a good thing, as opposed to asking people to show up and be just like everyone else. So next slide. All right, so today, as I said, we're going to be talking, Jennifer is going to be talking about how to build our ally muscle at work. Then I'm going to kind of bring in what I call a CEO's perspective and what are some practical things that we do here at my company, at People G2, and to my other companies. And we will have a couple different places for Q&A. So at any time you can throw in a question. You can also do it right at the end of Jennifer's presentation. We will pause for questions. At the end of my presentation, we will again have another opportunity for questions. So you'll have lots of opportunities. But even if you don't need your question answered right away, feel free to start popping them in there. That way we can get them organized. Okay, next slide, which I think is Jennifer, and I'll introduce her and let her take it away. Jennifer is an award-winning entrepreneur, dynamic speaker, and diversity and inclusion expert. She's passionate about social equality advocate. She is a passionate social equality advocate, committed to helping leaders foster healthier and more productive workplace cultures. I think this is where we meet, which is really interesting that Jennifer and I never actually met prior to getting this together, and yet I have discovered how many people we know and how many people we sort of have in common. It's kind of funny how the world works that way. She's a founder, president, and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting. I know she's been super busy this year with everything going on, and her consulting firm guides some of the world's largest companies in their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. She's an acclaimed keynoter and podcaster with her podcast, The Will to Change, and the author of the best-selling book, Inclusion, and her latest, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, an award-winning book that calls on allies and advocates everywhere to activate their voice. So please welcome Jennifer Brown. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. I know we do share a lot in common. It's good to really be here, and thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in and for being so passionate about this topic. So obviously, Chris, uniqueness you talked about as one of your 7 pillars, and that's going to be a lot of what I focus on. How can we build organizations that seek that uniqueness, that value that uniqueness, and that truly act on that uniqueness as a creative differentiator and a differentiator for engagement. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, everybody. And thanks to Veronica for driving slides, so you'll see her and me working together here. But I want to share with my personal story, my uniqueness, speaking of. So I was an opera singer that moved to New York to make it, and it was really exciting days in my 20s, and I trained really hard, but through the course of operatic training, which is really arduous, I ended up injuring my voice, and I had to get several vocal surgeries. And the recovery from those is complete silence for a period of weeks, and then when you're allowed to make a sound, all that comes out is a tiny squeak. And, gradually you work your voice back. But, my instrument would be forever compromised based on these things. And I knew that I would need to seek another way to be of service in the world. So it was heartbreaking. But what ended up happening is that I, as a performer, we're very agile. We're creative people, resilient. And I ended up finding my way to another field where I would be able to be on stages just in a different way. And I ended up getting a second master's degree in organizational change and HR, and proceeding to become a facilitator, a trainer, a corporate HR person for a while in training and development, and then reinvented myself as an entrepreneur in the space of team development and leadership, and ultimately DEI. We would pivot into that, and today we get to work with some of the biggest companies in the world to help them build their strategies for DEI, their training implementations and programs, and their affinity networks, and making sure people can bring their full self to work and feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. So P.S., I was meant to use my voice, just not as a singer. But the other way that I wasn't using my voice is that I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. So I've been out since I was 22, but I was closeted as a performer. And then as an entrepreneur, I wrestled with how I would close deals to largely, male audiences and clients at the time, while being authentic to myself and bringing my full self. And it's something that is something I still think about and I'm aware of in terms of the psychological safety aspect of walking through the world with both my visible and invisible identities in rooms where I don't perceive that I have any sort of likeness in terms of identity. And so it's an interesting situation to be in. And I wanted to share this concept that I read about by Kenji Yoshino, who wrote a book called Covering. It's an excellent book. But with Chris Smith, Kenji wrote this research study with Deloitte, and it's called Uncovering Talent. And in it, they did something really revolutionary and really helpful for me, which was that it gave language to the hesitation I have when I walk into rooms around my identity. And they name it covering, which is downplaying a known stigmatized identity. And it was helpful also because we think of bias as something that happens to us, right? We're sort of reacting to it. Covering is something I think we decide to do in ourselves in anticipation of the bias, in anticipation of being the only of our identity or someone who's not really acknowledged in a workplace. We downplay, we minimize, we might hide, or we may not be able to hide our diversity, but we certainly can avoid talking about it and making a big deal about it. So I thought this was fascinating because I still walk into rooms and I am consciously aware of what I bring and what's visible and what's invisible and making those choices. And it's on the next slide, it's something that I put a lot of energy towards. And so this report talks about how many of us cover on a regular basis, whether we modify our appearance to fit in, masculine, feminine expression, for example, affiliation. We may not want people to know about certain things in our life. Pre-COVID, it's interesting what we would hide, maybe parenting status, family needs, needs for flex, and the pandemic and working from home has actually, I think, shifted this piece. And I'd encourage you all to think about your covering behaviors before and after the pandemic hit, to think about, do you feel actually more able to be yourself when we are on screens with each other and we're beaming into each other's living rooms? So we sort of don't have a choice about uncovering, aspects of ourselves that we didn't want others to know. And did that sort of help rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak, in terms of building trust? Or is it something that still feels really kind of invasive to you? And so it's just something to think about. Advocacy-based covering is when we don't challenge jokes or comments, but we stop advocating for ourselves because we perceive that it's something that carries with it a risk of drawing attention to our stigmatized identities as we are advocating for our identity, right? Or as an ally for someone else's identity, which is something we'll get into in a bit. And then association is literally not wanting to be associated with, say, diversity and inclusion initiatives, and we want to do affinity group work, which is the LGBT network, the Black network, the Latinx network, and in the larger companies we work with, people will say, well, I don't want to be a part of that. I want to be judged based on my work. And so that, to me, speaks to an organization where there is a perception that there is a penalty of raising your hand about your difference, right? And so for me, and probably for all of you, we think about how much energy does this take, to be in a room and be sort of managing your psychological safety and your identity, and also there to do a job and be present and creative. It's very difficult to do it. I think for me, it feels like doing double work. And I only have several intersectional identities, but there are those of us who have more, and I'll get to that in a minute too. So relatively, the struggle can get more or less depending on how we identify. And so, you can imagine that people who are underrepresented or marginalized in organizations cover the most. So we've got LGBTQ people cover 83% on a regular basis on one of those 4 A's. Women do it, people with disabilities. What's interesting in the study is that this group reports covering as well. And this is one of those powerful moments in my keynotes and now my virtual presentations, where I share that straight white men report covering as well. And, some of these thought bubbles are, we might chuckle if we read them, but they're real. They're things that have been said to me, usually behind the scenes, usually one-on-one in a hallway and not in front of a group. And we get into really interesting conversations about vulnerability and authenticity and, what it means for a room full that looks like this to bring their full selves to work. We talk about that as a slogan all the time, but, these days it's getting really real. And I have walked into groups like this now, and I think to myself, how am I being inclusive of all the invisible aspects of diversity that may exist in a room that looks like this, and that's my work. My work on my own biases. And luckily, I've been sort of privy to so many people's truths, and it's such a gift and it's such a privilege to learn what I hear and what I'm entrusted with. And so our work right now is to help roomfuls of all kinds of people, and particularly roomfuls of straight white men, if we can put a fine point on that particular population, to say, how do we lead in these times when, the very sort of competency of leadership is changing under our feet, and it may feel incredibly unfamiliar and very uncomfortable to bring more of our full selves to work. And what does that even mean? And that's a really interesting journey to take with people. And I some of the most challenging and rewarding work that I do is to see the whole person and endeavor to do that, and then say, well, what does that have to do with leadership? What does that have to do with your efficacy in terms of being somebody that is a role model in this organization? Because often groups like this have positions of power. And so I use this metaphor of the iceberg to describe what I think occurs in both ourselves and in our workplaces, which is that, you know, we copy our leadership, we emulate what we see, we hide what we don't see, we downplay it. And when we think about the waterline and the iceberg, you know, 10% of the iceberg is visible, 90% is not. That 90% can be very dangerous to your boat or to your organization, or I might even argue to yourself professionally, because, you know, revealing some of these items that are under the waterline, these things are very deeply important to us, and in many ways they shape who we are. And when we say, you know, bring your whole self to work, when you think about all the things that people are minimizing and holding under their waterline and all the energy that they're putting towards doing that, that energy is energy that could be utilized to, you know, build the next product or have the next great idea or support a colleague in a different way or spend time growing your career and you're intentional about that. And so to me, like, it's a tremendous waste of potential and energy, particularly for those that have the most to hide. And I think that's the tragedy of this dynamic. And so my work has been focusing on thinking about how do I elevate different identities and quote unquote normalize or usualize. It's a new word that I just picked up because normalize is problematic. How do I usualize more diverse identities of all kinds? You know, you'll see under the waterline here, I have neurodiversity on the left side. I have immigrant status, people from families that are first generation. I have obviously age, sexual orientation, religion. On the right side, we have being sober and in recovery in a sort of business landscape that, you know, until pre-COVID was very sort of alcohol focused and after hours bars focused, which is not comfortable for everybody, and not just people who are sober in recovery from, but I would argue maybe some women, some LGBTQ people, et cetera. So it's a real opportunity to revisit sort of where do I set my waterline as a leader, and where I'm setting it, is it still serving me? I would argue we learn how to lead and what's okay and what's not okay from previous generations. And we also learn, you know, from what we see in our organizations, and we have a choice whether to emulate that or to break that mold and to challenge ourselves and be comfortable being uncomfortable and lower that waterline, which sends a signal to others that this is the kind of environment where this is not only okay, but we acknowledge that diversity and inclusion are needed in order to be creative, in order to build a great workplace, and to serve a really diverse world with our products and services. And so when you think about your waterline, if we had more time, Chris, I would ask people to, you know, think about what does your waterline look like? You know, what is underneath it for you? Where are you setting your line and why? Are there ways that you can challenge yourself to be more authentic and bring your full self to work? And in doing so, are you creating space for others to do the same? And I know for me, I don't always feel like coming out as LGBTQ, particularly on like very large stages, maybe in roomfuls where I'm one of the only women, let alone maybe one of the only LGBTQ people. But I think to myself, it's very important that I do this because it sends a signal and it really matters. So it's not about me. It's about whoever might see me and whoever might feel less alone.
Well, I really love, Jennifer, if you don't mind, I mean, just jumping in for a second, is that one slide where you sort of showed the white males, you know, that are doing that covering, right? And that kind of struck with me a lot. That would probably represent me pretty well, and a lot of people who are maybe trying to figure out where they sit in this place of how do they be better in work, how do they become an ally, which is the whole point of this. To know that other people are doing that covering is a really fantastic way to have a conversation, right? So if I'm covering in some way about something, it doesn't have to be under the umbrella of diversity and inclusion, but there's something, well, then I can understand how somebody else might be covering. So that's really great. I'm sorry to interrupt, but go right ahead.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. No, you're absolutely right. And it creates a trust and it opens up a door between you and another colleague. And it doesn't need to be the same exact thing. Like for me to come out as LGBTQ may open a door for somebody else to share about a mental health issue that they're struggling with. So it's metaphorically a way of building trust. But really what we share is that to be vulnerable with each other opens up a whole different line of communication. And back to like the pandemic environment and work from home, and then the Black Lives Movement, reflect on what has changed in our workplace and the way we work with each other. And I think that transparency about each other's lives and our challenges right now, we are learning so much about parenting, for example. We're learning so much, as male caregivers, at home, in a heterosexual example. We are learning so much about socioeconomic differences and whose families might be more differentially impacted with COVID, right? We're learning about equity issues. Our empathy quotient is much higher, I think, because we've been battling this foe together, but we've also been learning so much about how our battles are not equal. We might be in the same storm, but we're in very different boats, is a phrase and an image that I like to use. And so when the murder of George Floyd happened and we were all in front of our screens and we saw that, the reaction, I think, was incredibly different than it might have been in the past, and I think led to the movement that we're in right now. So it's really interesting, the whole arc of how this has happened. And I would argue the waterline is totally lowering in many organizations. And for some of us, it's scary to have it lowered, by the way, because it's very risky to be our full selves. It's risky for us to have other people understand what we struggle with on a daily basis that prevents us from doing our best work and contributing. So I don't want to discount the risk, but I know that, Black employees, for example, have wanted, I think, to say, hey, I want to bring my full self to work, but I'm not sure you can handle my truth. I'm not sure you can handle how I feel right now. And we're right in the middle of sort of understanding what has been acceptable in the workplace in the past and why that it was broken and it wasn't really conducive, and what does that need to look like in the future. So I think we're in this like really amazing moment of telling the truth for the first time, and then shaping our organizational structures around that. So thank you. So on the next slide, I get asked a lot about why is a white woman our keynote speaker on diversity? And I love that question, and I invite it. And I think of my aspects of my diversity and my diversity dimensions as somewhat intersectional. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor, Black woman professor, who coined intersectionality, and she meant and defined it as the overlapping stigmatized identities that some of us carry and sort of the exponential impact of that. So she, being a Black woman, differentiated the female experience and the Black experience, right? And so what we learned from this is that we cannot speak about women as a monolith, because there are so many intersectional identities within the community of women that need to be named, because those dictate an extremely different experience in the world, right? Different microaggressions, different biases, different levels of safety in the world outside of work. So that language is important. For me, I am intersectional in terms of being female and LGBTQ. And so those identities need allyship. I've always needed my straight allies. I've always needed my male allies. They make such a difference to me and to my community. We won gay marriage because, straight allies jumped into the game and said, like, how can I help? And so we're in a very similar moment now where many of us can be more activated allies for the conversation about Black lives and also inclusion in general. And, I feel very activated around the identities I carry that carry more ease, comfort, and privilege. And that means that those identities that I have, I can be that ally. And so I'm the kind of person, like a living, breathing example of how we can both benefit from allyship, and we desperately need that, and how we can also utilize and activate around our identities that make it easier for us to walk through the world and safer for us to walk through the world. And, so that I'm utilizing all of the pieces of me. And so sometimes people say, privilege is a bad word, Jennifer, I don't want to talk about it, or I'm so privileged, I don't know anything about diversity, look at me. Like my life, this is my life, I have nothing to say. My conversation then is, okay, so how are you activating the things that are less risky for you to do or say or interrupt or challenge, so that somebody that looks like me doesn't always need to be the one that's advocating and raising my hand and then covering, right? Because I'm worried about the impact on me over and over again, that's where that ally can step in. And I love that. We can also think of it as 360-degree allyship, reciprocal allyship. You know, allyship isn't just done like from somebody with power to somebody without power, although that's an important thing. It can be done amongst each other and for each other. Like Chris, I'd say, you know, on your learning journey, I'm happy to be your ally. Like I'm happy to hold that space for you so you can learn what my experience is like, my lived experience, as we say, so that you can progress on your journey. But you can also be my ally because you may have sort of that access that comes with being a white male, for example. Great. And then there's one more piece I want to bring for an explanation of the role allies play in lifting covering behaviors. I mean, it's very profound. But, you know, people that look like me in terms of my femaleness and being LGBTQ, and your Black and brown employees will tell you we can't be the ones that do all the work. You know, we have never been able to really create change because we're trying to do so from a place of less power and influence. And so I love this example of Captain Picard, you know, Patrick Stewart saying, you know, people listen to me because of the way that I look. And so this is how I'm going to use my voice for the most vulnerable. And so if we really want to change the type of an extent of energy that people are putting into covering, we need to step in, but we're afraid to. We are afraid to say the wrong thing. We don't want to intrude. We I think are feeling very like shame and guilt and a lot of emotions right now in this present time based on what we're learning and hearing and coming to understand, and many of us for the first time, about, for example, the Black experience in America, and it can be very overwhelming. And we can also be afraid of leaning on people too much for our own education too. So to do the emotional labor of educating us about their experience. So there's a million reasons to feel hesitant and paralyzed and not able to move forward. And yet we have to figure out how to get through these things in order to move forward. And so in my second book, which is called How to Be an Inclusive Leader, I designed a model that I think pinpoints the journey. You know, it defines, I think, the stages of the journey of allyship. And it felt to me when I wrote the book, Chris, that this didn't exist per se, and I wanted to equip people with something something concrete to locate ourselves. Because, you know, for me to take a next step on allyship will look very different than your next step, based on my lived experience, what I sort of know deeply, what may be new for you. And you may know other identities deeply that I may not know a lot about. Like you might have grown up with a parent with a disability, you know, so you have a deep, extensive knowledge of that community, and I don't. And so in this model, it's sort of circular. I didn't want to create it necessarily linearly because it is forward and back, and it's sort of this ongoing process, and we can be in many different places at once on the model. So I'd like to go through each stage, and then Chris, we can dialogue a bit more. But unaware phase one is I don't know there's a problem, and I have to say a lot of people that look like me, probably coming into this moment of the last 6 weeks or so would have said, you know, I don't know there's a problem with the police, for example. And I didn't ever notice. I was reading all the books and watching shows and consuming media by people that identify as I do. Maybe we never noticed that. Maybe we were really resistant because we think I'm a good person. I'm not a racist, you know, or I am great with women. Women are great with me. You know, in our organization, we have a lot of diversity and everybody feels they have a fair shot. You know, so it can be a little bit of denial stemming from the I'm a good person argument. It can also be a cluelessness about intent versus impact. You know, I'm well-intended and therefore, you know, I'm having the impact that's needed. And those are very different things, extremely different. So all of that can be going on and unaware. What we want to do is move from phase one to phase two to aware, which is, okay, I'm waking up. I know what I don't know. I'm realizing all the different things I need to learn and expose myself to. I'm sort of drinking from the proverbial fire hose, and it's intense. It's intense right now. I mean, I've been teaching this now for a year, but I would say right now it's really, there's a lot in aware. Even for me, every day, you know, I'm learning new language. And, you know, I find it really stimulating and an amazing opportunity as a leader and as a human to to be shifting my language constantly as I learn new things about different communities and how they would like to be referred to. But it can be, again, there's some paralysis risk there around too much. And even maybe even not even the right reading. You know, I know we're inundated with reading lists right now. And maybe you haven't found something that really resonates with you quite yet. And it just feels like either a chore or overwhelming, or you're very emotional. So in Aware, we are, I think, establishing a different learning process for ourselves. And then I'm hoping in Aware you realize these are the things I need to do on an ongoing basis to increase my education. And then also to look at myself and become self-aware around my biases, become self-aware about things I've heard and I haven't understood as a microaggression, for example, like things that I've let go in a meeting and I didn't say anything that actually, you know, created a moment of exclusion for someone and made them feel they couldn't bring their full self to work and force that water line up to a higher level. So in awareness, we are kind of reconciling and looking at ourselves with different eyes. Once we go, we don't want to stop in aware. We want to move into active, which is phase 3. So, you know, what good is knowledge if we don't activate around it? So in active phase 3, there's experimentation and trying new language and trying to intervene or interrupt or, you know, stop myself from, you know, making a certain decision where I see my bias at play. It is about speaking up, and it's an awkward phase. It's when we go public. It's when we start to take more risk. It's when we need to, you know, polish up that apology because we're going to need it. It's when we ask for feedback and say, how did I do? Did my intent match my impact? Oh, it didn't. What would I need to shift in order to have that impact? You know, and asking for that and adjusting. I always think in the stage of the growth mindset by Carol Dweck, right? The fail forward piece, the whole kind of not being fragile about getting it wrong and not making perfect the enemy of the good, and being comfortable being uncomfortable. And that's what this one really feels like is phase 3. But the point is that you're the weeble wobble. You know, you might get knocked down, but you pop back up. Pop back up. And through doing that, you develop resilience. You know, you develop the sort of ability to keep your eye on the prize and not make it about you or your emotions or how bad you feel or getting wrapped up in a lot of that, which Robin DiAngelo talks a lot about in White Fragility. That's fragility. Fragility is like having this emotional reaction and then making it all about you when really it's not all about you. You need to be a learner, and in a way you need to be very objective and very neutral and very steadfast as you move through this, because you can get derailed by a lot of these bad feelings about ourselves. And really what we're trying to do is learn about a system that we've all grown up in that we've never interrogated. And then from phase 3 to phase 4 is advocate level is like literally, I don't wait for permission. I challenge systems. I ask why do we do it this way? Why did this happen? Why did we let this happen? Great question. Who is responsible for this? What's my responsibility in this? And really holding people's feet to the fire and asking like systems questions versus just perhaps individual behavioral questions. It's more sort of org, like, you know, why do we have a pay gap? Why have we never looked at this before? What would we need to change to remove this, not just once, but going forward? You know, and a commitment to kind of seeing that through and the bravery to see that through. You've got to have that muscle very well developed so that you are like the ultimate weeble wobble. Like you are just coming back swinging all the time. You're consistent. And you're pulling other people up this continuum. You're reaching back. You're mentoring. You're holding people accountable. You really become a teacher. And like I said earlier, like we can be in a lot of different places on this depending on what identity that we're talking about. So for me, for being LGBTQ, I'm advocate level because I've been in the community for 25 years. But I'll tell you, even within the community of LGBTQ, there's a lot I need to learn about the trans community, about racism and homophobia and sexism in the LGBTQ community even. And so I'll reach back and try to increase my awareness about the trans experience or about intersectionality in the community, because I'm a white person in that community. So that's not my lived experience, but I need to be inclusive of that experience in my work. So I want to give you that because you could be a lot of different places, and that question always comes up. So anyway, Chris, that's a little bit about the model, and that's kind of all I brought, and I would love to just pause and dialogue with you and maybe answer any questions that are coming through.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when you first started talking about this. You started with that unaware phase one. And it surprises me how many people are sitting in that bubble. And I mean, if these bubbles were actually the size, right? If they were sort of size, maybe I think the unaware circle would be the biggest, or one of the biggest. I remember when in California, this was many years ago, was passing, I think it was Prop 8 at the time for gay marriage. I had so many people and family members say about the same thing to me. Well, I didn't know gay people wanted to be married. And it was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, why, you want to be married? Why would, it was like they were so unaware to what somebody else who they maybe don't have any interactions with, or to your point, are covering so much that they're not telling them that they're gay, or wherever, whatever that label is for them, that they have a partner or have someone they want to marry or whatever, and that conversation never even came up. So I'm sort of curious what you think we can do to help. Just that seems like phase one, right? Like we have phase one. Step one is how do we get people to be more aware in the right context at work of where other people are at?
That is the question. Because it's sort of you got to invite that kind of conversation, and somebody in the chat is saying it's basically frowned upon to talk about identity and protected areas in my workplace. So that makes all of this a lot harder, of course. But then I guess we resort to personal conversations with people to inquire, and really, really be curious and be open to responses and seeking a deeper connection with people, even if they're not in the mood to share with you or they don't trust you yet. I think that this allyship is about sort of consistently showing up to people. Right. And eventually when they're comfortable, I think they might trust you enough to say, well, actually, my family is struggling, or actually, like my son is, struggling with addiction, or actually, I'm diagnosed slightly, with Asperger's, or I'm bipolar. And so I think that establishing that kind of connection point and dialogue you have to earn it. It's not something. I'm struggling with a lot of people saying, well, Jennifer, I did what you suggested, and somebody told me they just didn't want to talk right now. So can I check that off my list? And I say, no, it's about letting people take their time to trust you, but indicating that you are not expecting them to do all the work. You're also putting yourself in a vulnerable place so that you set the example. And this is not just the manager, but it's colleagues too. Right. And you're dedicated to utilizing more identities in the workplace, because when we don't know who exists in our workplace, we can't address it. I can tell you, LGBTQ people and people with disabilities, they will not check the boxes on the HR surveys. They don't trust their institution with that information. And if they can hide it, they will. Right. And so how do we say you matter and all of who you are matters? And, I've learned about this covering dynamic. I don't want things to be interrupting your, ability to be present and to feel that you can thrive. And so I might say, what gets in the way of thriving here? And what do you spend energy not sharing, talking about? We actually even do the iceberg exercise as a team, like a meeting opener icebreaker. And sometimes people, believe me, there are sort of right under the surface stuff, and then there's really, really deep stuff. And so maybe the really deep stuff takes a while to, if ever, to be revealed. But I think there's a lot of work we can do just under the waterline, even to kind of say, like, if we don't talk about mental health at work, we're never going to adequately resource the pervasiveness of mental health challenges. Like, we have to be able to see it and know that it exists. And we have a bunch of people who are afraid to talk about how it manifests and how it interrupts their work. And so we should be worried about this, because it just, to me, it means, we're still asking people to conform and to assimilate. And I think we're getting a huge life lesson right now in how we basically said to Black employees, like, you can't talk about your experience here. Like, we expect you to show up and be professional, on Monday. And it doesn't matter. I think for me, the Pulse nightclub shooting for the LGBTQ community happened over a weekend. And then that Monday, I'll bet every single person remembers what that Monday was like at work. Did anybody ask me how I am? was anything ever said by my company leadership? If something was said, did anything happen as a result? Like, how did I feel that day? Did I feel further erased and not seen? Or did I feel that people see and value who I am and my identity here? And I think same thing was happening with a lot of the statements about Black lives. You know, the companies that were silent, the leaders that were silent, sort of did untold damage to their relationships with people in their organization. And some that weren't silent but gave kind of a lip service-y pronouncement with nothing to back it up were also, I think, causing further harm. And this has been a real moment of truth for a lot of leaders and a lot of organizations who I know have been resisting talking about many things that matter for a really long time. And I've been warning them. I've been saying, I know all this is bubbling up in your workplace, and you can only sort of hold the door for so long. You can only hold that water line really high for so long. This next generation coming in is demanding transparency and bringing our full selves to work and valuing all who we are. And yet, if there's so many things that are taboo in the organization, like, this is not going to be a place where people feel they can thrive.
Right. Well, we do have a few more questions in there, and it looks like you've been able to answer a few others, which is great, and we have a really good active group. I think what I'm going to try to do is maybe dive into a couple of the things that I was going to cover, because I think it will answer a few of the questions, and if it doesn't, then we will certainly jump back. I know we do have, there's our contact information. Just as a quick reminder, we will be sending out a copy of this presentation and with a link to the PDF version of the presentation. So you will certainly have these resources available to you. You can share them internally and have all of our contact information and all of that. But go ahead and go to the next slide. So, you know, this for me is always where I start any conversation about this, that so often everyone's thinking about diversity and how do we get a more diverse company and have more diversity, which is great, but if you don't add the inclusion part, right? When I love this sort of saying that if diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is actually being asked to dance. We can have diversity in our organizations, but if we don't really take on that inclusion part of it, it doesn't really matter what we've done. The diversity part is sort of pointless. So there's sort of a couple of questions that I thought we could talk about, and then I'll get into a really practical exercise that I do. I think a lot of organizations would like, and I think you need to click maybe 3 times there, Veronica, to get the little statements up. So, you know, can hiring managers approach diversity in the wrong way? And I would tell you, absolutely. So many programs are sort of meant in the right way, but kind of are not really hitting the right context. And certainly you can read, I'm not going to read all of these off, but the one that really struck with me the most was that we need to remove the pressure from hiring managers and leadership that our diversity and inclusion programs are somehow going to right all of the social inequity that's ever happened. Right? We feel this pressure, we feel this guilt, we feel this need to want. We can only do as much as we can do in our companies to improve as much as we can, but we can't take on. We can't be what's that guy? It's not Atlas holding the giant world, right? Or what's the guy, the Greek, trying to push the rock up the hill. We can't take on the whole entire world's problems, and I think we can do our best in our communities, in our companies, in our places where we volunteer, where we have influence, where we have the ability to make change, and really focus our efforts there to do our best, and not, because if we look at it, it's too big of a problem otherwise. Then we give up, we shrug, and we say, how am I ever going to make this change? How am I ever going to bring this to the table when there's so much work to do? And I feel like that's what stops a lot of people in being allies and in really helping, is to, instead of reframing it to how can I help those people I know? How can I help those people in my company as a way in which you can make a difference? Okay, next slide. The second question is, are there limits to diversity? Can your team be too diverse? So again, diversity for the sake of diversity without bringing in inclusion is always going to be a struggle for you. There are some benefits to people who, we do want to have people who think a certain way in particular jobs. That makes sense. I mean, so we can have to play with that. But really, the research is that organizations that place an emphasis on gender and ethnic diversity traditionally outperform the other companies. So the evidence is that you're going to be hard-pressed to be too diverse. And I do feel that I hear that from people sometimes. Like, can we be too diverse? Can we have too much arguing? Are we going to have too many opinions? And the answer is probably not. If you get to that point, you can always figure out how to deal with that. That's a much different problem than having a singular thought and process and voice and getting stuck. Okay, next question, which is, sorry, there's little things there. All right.
Mm-hmm.
We will send out this PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So then, how do I make diversity work for my company, and how do we get the most value? Go ahead and click through that. I think there's 2 or 3 there. So we really want to make sure that we look at this through the lens of uniqueness, and I'm going to go through that. I think Jennifer's done a great job of talking about that. If we are talking about how we are different, if you as a leader, someone in an organization is asking and thinking about how we can talk about how we're different, celebrate how we're different, you've already begun a much better conversation, because I find it is natural for us to show up and try to talk about what makes us the same. What is it we like that is the same? We like the same baseball team. We like the same kind of pizza topping. Whatever these simple things are. But we're trying to connect with someone, which is a good thing to do. But instead, we ought to maybe try to connect on what we're struggling with. Even if it, as Jennifer, was a perfect quote, we're in the same storm, but we're in different boats. I love that. Absolutely love that, right? So I don't have to understand your particular struggle inside your boat, but we are in the storm of trying to maybe deal with what we're all each dealing with ourselves. Okay, next one. So you can probably go twice here. We can skip that one. The next one is to really think about, what's the story you're telling yourself, right? What is the story you're telling yourself about Black Lives Matter, about how LGBTQ, scenarios or requests or the conversation? What is it that you're telling yourself that's stopping you from moving forward and having those conversations and making a change? And ultimately, you will probably find a really flawed story. You will find something that is about your own interactions and your own kind of, insert your BS here, right? We all have it. I find if you can start there, what is it I'm telling myself about why I'm struggling to help, to talk about this, to understand the other person, you will probably find most of the story you need to unravel before you even have to talk to anyone else about it. Because it's often our own fear, our own prejudices, our own upbringing, our own, what things our parents and our family have said or not said. So really look at where you're at yourself. I have found that has been my best. That reflection time, being introspective, has helped me with most of my growth to get past my own pre-programming before I could then get on to help somebody else that may be struggling. Okay, next slide. And so in my book, we talk a lot about uniqueness. And if you're not sure how to think about uniqueness, go back and ask your team to do a little exercise and let them pretend that your company now only sells pencils. Those little yellow pencils that we used to use in school, for a Scantron, for any of you old enough to have Scantrons. And ask how you would differentiate yourself as a pencil company with yellow pencils and orange erasers. What are the different ways that you could think about being unique and displaying how you're unique and talking about what you're unique and finding ways to be unique, right? It's a very boring, simple exercise. And to get people talking about all the different ways you could be unique selling this very ununique product. And it's usually a really good and fun way to get people talking about something really safe, about all the different ways to think about it. And then you can translate that into, now how is our team unique? What are all the different ways that make us unique? And do we really understand each other? Do we really? And you might find that there are people willing now to share, because you're demonstrating uniqueness as a positive. You're demonstrating uniqueness as an advantage. And now you can transition that into your team. Some people may not feel comfortable sharing a lot. That's okay. Everyone's going to be a different spot on their journey, but you may find people who, I've been shocked when I've done this. Some people raise their hand and said things to me I didn't even know about them. I didn't ask them. I didn't put them on the spot. But because we did an exercise first that opened that door, they were then able to take that a step further. And I find that to be really good way to kind of start that conversation with your team. Next slide. The next one is group thought. And this is a cognitive bias. And if you aren't thinking about cognitive biases, if this isn't a part of your conversation with diversity and inclusion, I think you're really missing some opportunities, because our brains are constantly trying to shortcut things for our own benefit. It thinks it's helping us, and often it's tripping us up. So there's 3 there, I think, Veronica, if you can click into that. And, I ask everyone to consider your own conclusions on an issue before considering those of others. It is so easy to go along with the group. If we always say be open-minded, and I think that's turned into this trick where we listen to everyone else and we're suddenly influenced by everyone else's opinions. That could be good, and it could also be really bad if your organization is struggling at being inclusive, right? If everyone's sort of cutting everyone off, saying, no, we're not going to think about that, and you're just going to go along with it because everyone else is. It's pretty hard to be an ally in that regard if 9 people in the meeting are all saying no, and you should be saying yes. So consider your own conclusion first. Then it's okay to consider other conclusions, but at least be sure about what you think. Then some really great ways to think about challenging them, because I feel a lot of us want to be allies, and maybe you don't feel like you have the power. Maybe you don't have the position on the hierarchy. Maybe you feel like your job is going to be threatened if you are going to raise your hand and disagree. There are strategies. So the first one is ask permission to disagree. So if you're in a meeting and you feel like there's something going on, raise your hand and say, is it okay if I maybe disagree with everyone for a moment? 99% of the time you will get, of course, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You kind of flip the switch on them. You get them, they've now said, yes, you're allowed to disagree. They sort of set them up. It's pretty hard for them to be mad at you now if they disagree with you, right? Because you've set them up for that. And if you still don't feel comfortable with that, maybe you really are that extra introverted person, the next strategy down is to say, well, what if we tried this? Or that's a great idea, everyone. You clearly have thought about this, but what else would we do if we didn't do that? Just to get people thinking about new ideas and new ways to do things, again, as a way to help us advocate. If we show up and say, no, you're wrong, you're a racist, you're a jerk, that's not going to work, you are not going to get very far. We all have had those discussions and it has not gone well. But if we say, what else could we do? Or what if that policy might make other people feel not welcomed? What if that might silence other voices? Or what else could we do that might be better? And you will find that discussion helps open people's minds to come up with better solutions without us having to raise our hands and say, no, Tom, you're a racist, I'm not going to do that, and putting ourselves in a conflict, or swallowing our tongue because we're not brave enough to say such a thing. So, okay, next slide. So I'm going to give you that little exercise I promised, and we're almost done with the slides, and we will then get into any other questions that we haven't gotten to. Really, there's so many great questions. I really appreciate everyone. We use Gallup Strengths Finders, and by accident, when we did this, I found this really cool way to kind of deal with or help with diversity and inclusion inside organizations. So if you never done Gallup Strengths Finders, like $20 a pop, you can have all your employees do it. It gives you your 5 best strengths. I think it's really cool because you're only talking about strengths, you're not talking about weaknesses. And it gives everyone a cool lens to talk about what are they good at. Next slide. So we took that data of all of our employees and we mapped it out and said, what are all the strengths we have in our organization? And what we found was we were really heavy in certain areas like responsibility and positivity, and those are all great. But we had nobody in belief. We had nobody, I think, in analytical. We had nobody in these very clear spaces, and it got me thinking, well, how can I have diversity of thought? I'm thinking of diversity of thought. I wasn't thinking about diversity from a social context. I was just thinking about thought. And I just made this policy because I have that power and ability. I said, guess what, guys and gals? I'm not going to hire anyone who does not have at least one of their strengths in their top 5 of one that we're missing. So I only want to do final interviews. We have no one in analytical. Go find someone who's got analytical in their top 5. Go find someone who has conscientiousness. We have none of that, right? And because I wanted to kind of change the conversation in our company for the better. Lo and behold, I started getting different people I never got it in final interviews. They looked different, they talked different, they thought different, and it was like this, light bulb moment where I realized we're asking our hiring managers to be more diverse, to think about diversity and inclusion. They didn't have a great way to do that. They didn't have a way to think about what that meant. And for us, this worked really well. Instead of asking them to go hire more females or more males or this person or that person or this type, instead of asking them to put a label on it and go find those people, I asked them to find the people who fit our weaknesses just on a strength standpoint. And it also, by accident or maybe by stupid design, we find our best ideas that way sometimes, allowed us to do that. It gave us that mechanism. So if you find that you've been talking about this with your hiring managers and it's not been happening, you're just not getting there, they may not know where to look. They may not know to look for that type of person. They may need this kind of structural help. And there's been quite a few questions that kind of relate to this issue. I have been struggling in a lot of the conversations I've had because people really want to change people on an individual basis. And that's hard. But when I took a step back and I thought about all of the work I've done as a consultant for culture, we've talked about having these difficult people. We talked about having these bad managers. And there are people that are so acutely bad that, yes, we need to get rid of them. But in most cases, we change the system. We change the culture. We change the process. And that seemed to cure the person because they understood what the rules were on how we're going to operate, right? The framework changed. The rules have changed. The leadership said, this is what we value, and people adapted. And I think that's where we can find our biggest improvements in our society and inside our companies is by making it known what is acceptable here, creating processes and places where we can help people with how we want to change, as opposed to going back and having a single conversation with a single person to tell them, well, you did this thing wrong and this thing wrong. Again, there are those acutely terrible people or whatever that we need to deal with. But for that general minutia, where I think most of the struggle can really be gone after, we have to help people by putting in better structures, better processes, and it has to be consistent. Over and over and over, we have to be talking about this and living it and breathing it and teaching it over and over and over. So go ahead and go to the next slide. I always bring this up in all my webinars, Daniel Pink's work. If you're not talking about autonomy, mastery, and purpose inside your company, I think anything you do is going to fail if people don't have these 3 things in their lives. So make sure you're thinking about that. Next slide. I do want to thank People G2 for hosting this webinar. It looks like there's our information. Well, is that the right one? Go to the next slide. We may have had a mixed up slide there. Oh, there we go. That's People G2. So if you're interested in background checks, we'd love to talk to you or drug testing. And next slide, it's for Jennifer and I's information. It looks like I made one error, which happens once a year, unless you talk to my wife. And so my Twitter is actually Chris P. Dyer now. We did modify that. So if you were, a couple of people asked on the Q&A about the Twitter, so we fixed that. But Chris P. Dyer. There's our contact information. I do want to make sure we get to a couple questions here. So Jennifer, one came all the way from Brussels. David asked, in Europe, some countries impose a woman quota to public organizations and even to enterprises. 25% of the managers have to be women, for example. I think this weakens the position sometimes of women in position. What are your thoughts about measures like this?
Yeah, I'm a little cynical about how change happens, and if we wait for change to happen because people somehow see the light and feel that it's the right thing to do, or hopefully also understand the business case for, better representation when it comes to gender and other dimensions. If we wait for all of that to happen organically, the problem is that the progress isn't very fast. It's just kind of human behavior. We don't like to change, and we are, I know Americans are particularly resistant to being forced to do things that we don't want to do. Witness the mask debacle. So I think that actually, personally, I'm a fan of setting targets for greater representation because people understand it. We say in business, what gets measured gets done. And I do think that the public boards of public companies in Europe diversified to include, I think, 40% women, and they were given like a year or two to achieve that. And I think most of them achieved it somehow. They miraculously found female board members, and then they miraculously put them in place, and the world didn't end. And I think that was a really interesting example of it's not hard, but we have to put our mind to it, just like everything else, and we may need to require it so that it happens. But I think that I'm very impatient with the rate of change. When we don't require things, it's just very slow. So if we're okay with things being slow, we can keep working incrementally, but it's not going to be the big change we need. And we have a long way to catch up. I mean, we're extremely behind. I mean, the pay gap for women is extremely sort of slow moving and slow to change. What do we say? It's going to be, I forget the year, when women are going to make the same as men, but it's a long time from now. So, what would we think of legislation to, force that issue? I'm a fan of that personally. And I don't think, people can argue it's bad for women to feel that you are being a quota or you're being tokenized. I think most women would be thrilled with a more equal playing field in order to achieve what they know they're capable of being. So I don't quite buy that.
Yeah, there's no perfect answer. And I think I share your sentiment that it's better that we push that representation, that when we start moving that forward, even if that means there's a little bit of that issue, right, which we can deal with. That seems like an easier issue to deal with than the fact that there's lacking any representation at all. Okay, the other question, I want to make sure I get to it, came in early on from Faye. What can I look for in the workplace to see that the effects of covering and opening up so I can more empathetically respond and help?
Yeah, I think that, employee engagement surveys, if they're really well designed and then you can cut the data by diversity dimension, they will tell you a lot about how who's not bringing their full selves to work and why and what sort of barriers they're experiencing and headwinds and challenges. And so sometimes we get that data through focus groups and surveys when we come in and do the consulting piece. And it's really important, though, the questions you ask are really the important ones, right? And so as a manager, I would make it a regular practice to say, do you feel we're set up in a certain way to support all of your personal needs, family priorities, health, and sort of consistently revisit those questions, not just with people who look like they may be struggling, but with everyone, because by the way, you may be completely wrong. You don't want to make an assumption about how someone identifies, because we can't really tell who someone is sitting across from them, right? We've learned that. But opening that door up for that conversation to say, I'm here to help. If you have positional power, you actually can challenge policies and practices that are missing key things. But if you're a colleague, you can also say, how can I utilize my voice to make sure you're heard, or your great ideas are attributed to you, or how can I would like to give feedback to someone if they're speaking over you, or if I hear a microaggression like I did in that meeting, I'd like to say, would you like me to say something? I'd like to say something. Stepping up and doing things, even just in the day-to-day life of being with colleagues and noticing the exclusion dynamics is part of how you can activate your ally voice. And somebody will likely share, what their life is like on a day-to-day basis when you invite that. And you'll learn a lot about what their experience is like.
Sure.
Yeah, so I do think it depends. If you're coming at this from a management perspective, you have a systems responsibility to say policies, practices, is this, would you recommend this, in a promoter score, right? Would you recommend this place to work or not? And what does the culture feel like here? What is celebrated here? We don't have visible diversity. How does that feel? How do you think people experience being of that identity in this workplace? And if you can ask that and people will trust you to answer that question, you will learn a lot. And then the question is, okay, what do I want to do with that information? Who do I escalate that to, or how do I become a truth teller in my organization about what's really going on versus what sort of people want to believe, which is that, oh, we're great. We don't really, we do everything great, which I'm always amazed. That would never be my attitude. But I think a lot of organizational leaders are just shocked when I give focus group feedback from different identities. It's like they've never heard it before. And so, how did that gap occur? So I just think that's a fascinating thing to sort of take apart and say, are you really listening to your employees? Do you really know them? Do you really understand your privilege in walking around and having certain things in the system work for you that don't work for someone else? And how much do you know about that?
Right. Well, there's lots of great questions, and I'm just trying to pick out ones that kind of represent some of the other, kind of general questions. That way we can kind of, instead of repeating ourselves. Patty did have a question, said we did a lot of diversity training and harassment training, and it does not seem that the training really worked or stuck. What can leaders do to really create a fully inclusive workplace? And I will say, if I can take a shot at this for a second, that I view any change management process as how do we get 1% better? And we need to set these sort of small goals on how do we get a little bit better today or a little bit better this week, and then how do we get a little better again next week, as opposed to how do we go from point A to Z. And I feel like that's the biggest problem in any change management, any sort of initiative that we're trying to do too much change too fast. And so we get really excited and we look at it and then we run away and suddenly forget about it, right? We lose all of our energy, as opposed to can this be an initiative we think about every day or every week or in every team meeting? I don't know if you have any other thoughts to that, Jennifer, but for me, that's the only way to make change work is to make it consistent and incremental.
It's like practice every day. It's hygiene. I think of it as any other health practice we would do is checking in on, how inclusive was that meeting that I always run, and do I think it was great, but other people didn't, am I inquiring? Am I asking for feedback? Am I checking in? So training is not the same as having a robust strategy. A lot of people mistake training for strategy, and it's not. So training can't fix everything. And often training around unconscious bias actually leaves people feeling less competent in terms of enacting new behaviors. And that's one of the sort of scandalous findings that rocked my world, was that unconscious bias training not only doesn't work, but it's everybody's go-to, and it doesn't work, and it actually backfires in terms of making people feel, okay, this is just going to happen because I'm human, and I'm really powerless in the face of it, and it makes me a bad person. So, you put all that together, and it's not a very activated place. So I do think, I agree with you. I think it's consistent little actions every day, reinforcing those and building accountability measures. I mean, if we judged managers on how inclusive their team feels and how people, feel they have every opportunity to thrive across the board of identities, if we sort of incentivize that and we rewarded performance based on that, I think we'd see people going beyond the training and really investing and saying, I want to change and be better, and I'm going to apply myself in a consistent way. So, and even rewarding them for that. I mean, I think someday we will see performance management and rewards orient themselves around inclusive behaviors. And the hard part is just measuring it. I think we all struggle with, how do we see it when it happens? How do we know it when it's there? How do we define it? And then how do we teach people to exhibit those behaviors? And that's something we're still I think we're putting together in our world, frankly. So it's for the future. But we need to figure that out so that we can define it, so we can measure it, so we can reward it, and so that we can role model it.
Well, I totally agree. And Jennifer, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on with me. I'm, again, just shocked that we were just sort of now getting acquainted, and this was the perfect way for us to learn more about each other.
Yeah.
While everyone else is watching. So I'm really, I learned so much from you and hearing everything that you brought to the table today. There were some fantastic questions. We had a great group, and I know there's a couple hundred others that signed up that are around the world that will be getting the presentation later when they wake up. And if anyone is interested in having Jennifer or I help you with your organizations or continue to work, there's our contact information. Please go ahead and reach out, and we're happy to further that conversation with you. But again, and Jennifer, I will give you the last word.
Oh, thank you. Well, I would just tell everybody to think about what you're underutilizing in terms of your own access or comfort. That's something that's less risky for you to confront or interrupt or challenge or identify or enact to create an environment where people don't feel that they always have to be doing all the work and advocating for themselves, because that is what's leading to the exhaustion that a lot of our colleagues are feeling. Particularly the Black community, who has not been heard and I think respected for a long time, and yet is having all the sort of reactions and feelings. Just to use that one example, but there's other examples around being LGBTQ and being closeted and sort of not outing somebody, but interrogating why do people feel afraid to bring their full selves here, and like, what can I do to change that environment so that someday they would feel comfortable being all of who they are here, so that we can get the best from each other. And I think that we all have a role to play in changing the system around us and not waiting for others to do it for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, great. Thank you, everyone. I know we went a little bit late, but there was still a lot of you stayed around for us, so we thought we'd get through all those questions. And again, we will send out a copy of the presentation, the video recording, and thank you to everyone for all the really great questions, all the really nice comments. We're here to try to spread what we know and to hopefully make a difference. So now it's your turn to go and do the same at your workplace. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.